everyone, my name is Rod Jans, and you're listening to the Get Inspired Talks podcast. Today's guest is Joe Roberts from the Push for Change Foundation. Joe went from being homeless on the streets of Vancouver in the 1980s to being a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur to successfully completing a 17-month, 9,000-kilometer charity walk across Canada, pushing a shopping cart to raise awareness and funds to prevent youth homelessness. Please welcome our guest, the Skid Row CEO, Joe Roberts. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Just before I introduce our guest, I just want to remind everyone that there's going to be an event held on October 20th. It'll be the Get Inspired Talks event at the Vancouver Trade and Convention Center. People like our guest today, Joseph Roberts, who are innovators and change makers and making the world a better place, will be at the event. So please stay tuned for more. We'll have more information on the getinspiredtalks.com website if you want to check that out. So we're going to talk about the push for change. We're going to talk about pushing a shopping cart across Canada. That must be quite the story. Before we get there, what was your life like before your business success and starting this organization? What was life for you like growing up?
I think that if I look back, there's a number of different ways to look at it. But I think I was, that typical human being that had a powder keg of potential, but hit a few roadblocks very early in life and had that potential hidden from me. I believe that each and every one of us have a deep a sense of possibility, but lifes us, and things happen. And what happens is then that possibility or potential becomes hidden from us. When I was 8 years old, I came from a normal middle-class family, grew up in Midland, Ontario, about an hour and a half north of Toronto. My dad was a breadwinner of the family. I had an older brother, younger sister, and a mom who was a stay-at-home mom. And our life all of a sudden shifted one day. Dad passed away suddenly. So all of a sudden we went from sort of a lower middle-class family to struggling and wondering, what was next for us. I remember my mom, going through a lot of fear and anxiety. Here she was, a homemaker, having to raise 3 kids, ages 5, 8, and 11. And so what ended up happening is mom remarried. Now, the man who came into our house next wasn't like my father. My dad was this great guy. He was this, he was a baseball coach. He was a hockey coach. He was an extraordinary guy, but I looked up to him. He was my hero. And the man who replaced him wasn't anything like him. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so all of a sudden, a couple of big things happened in our life. The first is early childhood trauma. And so at a very young age, I had this belief that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't worth it. And I watched like half of their hands go up. And so this is a common thing. The difference between kids that end up on the street or in addiction or sucked into gangs or get scooped up into the sex industry is that foundation at home. And I didn't have a good one. Now, when you look back at my story, there's 4 key pieces. Now, this is the teachable, okay? There's 4 key things that happen. 1, I was struggling with mental health and addiction. 2, I was struggling with early childhood trauma. The death of my father, the abuse of my stepfather. 3, by the time I was 16, I was dealing with family conflict. I couldn't get along with that stepfather anymore. And I couldn't live in that house anymore. And 4, I had the antecedents and already the beginnings of addictions. Now, those 4 key things are the things that lead to this phenomena we know as youth homelessness. And we know that if we don't address kids that are homeless, they eventually become adults that are homeless. There I was at the age of 24, living in 22, 23, 24, living on the streets of downtown Vancouver, addicted to drugs, pushing a shopping cart. But my story ends well. I got a second chance. And the turning point for me, I was sitting on a park bench in Pigeon Park in downtown Vancouver in the pouring rain 3 days before Christmas, 1989. And I reached out and I asked for help. And what's really interesting about that moment is I made a deal. I made this little promise with God and myself. And, I never really described myself as a deeply religious person, but I always believed there's been something over my shoulder taking care of me and looking out for me. And I made a deal and I said, if I could get off the streets, if I could get sober, I promise I will give it my 100%. I will give it absolutely everything I have. I won't squander this. And The second promise I made is if I did get a second chance at life, I would help somebody else. I'd pay it forward. I was surrounded by people who were kind of supporting me and helping me, the Salvation Army being one of them. I connected with them. They reached out to my mom. My mom brought me back to Toronto area. I entered into a drug treatment center. I got my life together. I went back to school. I graduated 3 years later, 3.5 years later with straight A's. I got 5 years sober. I moved back to Vancouver and I got involved in the business world. And in less than 12 years, I went from a guy pushing a shopping cart in the downtown east side of Vancouver to being on the cover of Canadian Business and Maclean's magazine as a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur. My context in life is that there's more to each and every one of us than we can see. But sometimes that's hidden. And sometimes, we get stuck. Some of your listeners right now, maybe they're going through things. Maybe they're going through depression. Maybe they're going through, some uncertainty in their career. Maybe they're going through some health issues, right? The key thing to remember is that we're not defined by the circumstances in life. We're defined by our reaction to those circumstances. And if you understand that, then your only job today is to take that next step forward, to find out that you're so much more than the adversity that you're facing today. The way I tell my story today is the way I understand it through a research base. When you take a look at what are the antecedents, so I've sat down and I've worked with, and had conversations with guys like Gabor Mate and who's our friend in Calgary who runs the center, Marie? Sheldon Kennedy. Sheldon Kennedy, former hockey player, child abuse victim. At the core of all addictions and is that or homelessness or what have you, is that something happened before that happened. Like, so you look at an addict or somebody smoking a crack pipe on the corner downtown, and all you are is repulsed by the behavior. You don't actually ask that empathic and compassionate question, what happened to drive that person to the place where they need that substance so bad to deal with the emotional uncertainty in their life?
Yeah.
What's going on for them? And when we begin to collapse that, then we can treat and not judge. But we've got to get past the stigma, man, because the people that are going through this stuff, it's not about getting a haircut and getting a job. It's about dealing with that underlying trauma, then dealing with sort of that base level Maslow's theory of hierarchy stuff. We need to deal with shelter. We need to deal with services. And when we when we sort of turn that table, that's when we begin to win culturally. That's when we begin to win as a city, as a province, as a country. And that's where the individual wins, and it's where the community wins. But it's, the greatest asset that I have today is that I used to push a shopping cart in the downtown east side, because I get an opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister of Canada. I get an opportunity to meet with decision makers and stakeholders and philanthropists. I've had the opportunity to meet with and talk to people who can actually make that change and tell a story in a way that gets them inspired, but also has them see it through a different perspective. And it's also one of the reasons why, we ended up doing this national engagement project and walking across the country. In fact, how that all came about is I was sharing my story in a corporate engagement setting in Montreal 7 years ago in October. It was actually October 10th, 2011. So it'll be coming up on, 8 years. And I shared my story to the 400 folks for Aeroplan Canada and the rewards company. And so I shared this story, and then we actually got interactive with them. We asked them, okay, now that you know the story of how youth homelessness happens, how would you like to make a difference for the kids here on the streets of Montreal? And they all said, yeah, let's do it. So within the course of 30 hours, we actually had them make sandwiches to understand food scarcity. We had them go out and panhandle in the subway system of Montreal, which, we actually set that up hoping that they would fail, because we wanted them to come back and go, see, that wasn't very easy, is it, getting rejected? Well, they came back with $13,000 in change. Okay? So this was a learning point for us, Rod, because what happened was we thought that they would go out and get rejected and come back with their tail between their legs. But what they did is they went out and inspired individuals to help those less fortunate. Then we had them sleep outside, and they actually got to experience the night a night in the life of a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old in the streets of Montreal on a cold October night. When we were finished, they told me that they'd never experienced anything like this in their life, and they had completely forever changed and transformed the way they thought about youth homelessness. And so I walked away from that thinking, if we can do it with 400, what could we do if we went across the country? You know, the federal government, what could we do if we get inspired and get others inspired to make a difference? Now, all of this was fueled by that promise I made on that street corner. Because after I did Aeroplan, it was like, this is the promise. That's that promise I made. I need to take this and expand it. And so I was on an airplane ride with a friend of mine at the time. His name's Dr. Sean Richardson. He's a sports psychologist, former Olympic athlete, real smart guy. And we were working together. And I said, Sean, how could we take this and go across the country? I want to take this experience we had in Montreal, and I want to go from community to community, do my best to share my story, collapse the stigma, raise some money, and get a conversation going on what we could do to prevent stories like mine from happening. And Sean said, he's funny, he says, when Canadians want to raise money for things, Joe, they run across the country. He said, it's kind of our thing. He says, why don't you run across Canada? And I think I said, why don't you run across Canada? At the time, I was a 45-year-old, overweight, overworked business guy. The last thing I didn't want to run to the store. And he says, well, maybe you don't run, maybe you walk. And I said, walk, run, swim, bike, it's all been done. I said, what's going to make that difference? This was my business training, right? What's my value proposition differential? Got a great story. Yes, engaging Canadians that way would kind of work, but how do you make it unique and different? And he said, I got it. He says, why don't you push a shopping cart? It's a symbol of chronic homelessness. And when we launched on May 1st, 2016 in Cape Spear, Newfoundland, after over 6 years of hard work to get the campaign to that place, we were fully funded. And honestly, that was very unique. Most campaigns, unless they're corporate run, don't have, they're not fully funded. They live out of donation bucket, the money that people give you along the way. And we made a rule in our charity that said we're not going to ask Canadians to support youth homelessness and then use that money for the trek. On May 1st, 2016, in Cape Spear, Newfoundland, we left. We had. And over the next 17 months, I slowly walked 24 kilometers every single day, rain, shine, snow. 17 months later, walked into downtown Vancouver, having walked 9,064 kilometers. Now, to put that in perspective for anybody out there with a Fitbit, that's 11,375,000 steps. Yeah, when we started, it was quiet. We just kind of slowly left St. John's. We had a couple of key events with some stakeholders in the city. And then, our next event was Clarenville, Newfoundland, with like 15 people. And then Corner Brook, we had, 25 people at a Rotary Club. And then but slowly as we moved across the country, we started to gain steam. By the time we got to Ontario, we had the full unfettered support of the Ontario Provincial Police. And once we had that, we started busting into the schools, and the conversation started to rise. And yes, we were raising money, but we were meeting with provincial leaders. We were meeting with federal task force people that were involved in this national conversation, and not just on youth homelessness, but on homelessness in general. Then we got a call from Jean-Yves Duclos, Minister Duclos, who was the right-hand person to Prime Minister Trudeau, who was hired to actually look at the issue of homelessness in Canada and how can we sort of approach the problem differently. We got a chance to meet Adam Vaughan, and when we were in Thunder Bay, we met Minister Patty Hadjou. Then we got invited back to Ottawa to meet with the Prime Minister. And so when it was all done, we raised, I believe about $600,000, but we had a conversation with millions of Canadians. And the federal government announced a $40 billion investment over 10 years to better address issues of housing and prevention for all things homeless. Now, we didn't do all that, but we were a part of that conversation. So in the beginning, it was quiet. There was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know if we were going to have an impact. But I remember one moment we were standing in Young and Dundas in downtown Toronto, and Pinball Clemens is on stage with Rod Black, and he's given us a donation, and then we turn on Hockey Night in Canada, and Don Cherry's doing a shout out. And when we walked into Ontario, Walter Gretzky was there to meet us. It was stuff like that. It's really, really cool. Walking across Canada gave me a new passion, a new love for the country, because what we set out to do, we did. We raised money, we raised awareness, and it wasn't what Marie and I and the campaign did. This is very important, because this is where we're going now. It was what other people did. We got inspired, we inspired others, and they joined our promise. See, it wasn't what I did. Yeah, it's great. Guy walks across Canada. But people cycle across Canada all the time. But does the country react to it? Yeah. See, that's what we learned was difficult. In the trial, we learned that, guess what? Nobody really cares unless you get them to care. And the only way to get them to care is to inspire them. Wow. Why do we so love and revere, in my opinion, the greatest hero that Canada ever has known, Terry Fox? Why do we love him? Because he showed us something about ourselves and about our nation. That Canada is a country filled with change makers. You don't have to convince people to do good. You just got to give them an opportunity to hitch their wagon to it. If you inspire them and do something that makes people go, wow, that guy's committed to his cause, I'll support him. And so over the campaign, it wasn't me walking, in the 40 below weather in Northern Ontario. It was what those kids did in response to us. It was the police giving us everything that we needed. It was the pipe fitters and the unions helping us with cash donations. It was the government coming out and walking with us. It was kids in grade 4 and 5 doing sleep outs and writing poems and collecting money and Kool-Aid stands and making coloring books and selling them online. It was these tens of thousands of other commitments and promises that gave the push for change life and vitality. If nobody responded, nothing would have happened. These politicians and money follow that what's popular. So you make it popular. The money that we raised, 100% of it went to raising the roof. And that money was used to invest in something called the Upstream Project, which is a program that preempts youth homelessness, that works with kids in the school systems, pre-identifies young people who are dealing with trauma, dealing with addiction, dealing with sexual abuse, dealing with problems at home, and gets them resources before they end up on the street. We piloted that program, and again, there's a whole, pages of testimonial and stories of little Johnny who was going to be homeless, who isn't, little Jane who was about to be homeless, who isn't. We piloted that program. That program is successful. Now we have the body of evidence to continue to advocate the provincial government and the federal government to continue to invest in this stuff. Look, if we're ever going to get to the place where we see a sunset on homelessness, whether youth or otherwise, we need to invest in prevention. We need to get around people's lives who are beginning to, somebody who's having that mental health breakdown, somebody's having those addiction crises. We need to get services around them before they end up under the viaduct. Do that, not only does that person win, does their family win, does our community win, but as pragmatic taxpayers, we win because it costs less to do that. So for the highly conservative listener out there who may say, well, we shouldn't invest in this. Hey, look, you can pay me $10 for this, or you can pay me $150 for this, your choice. It's all the same bucket of money.
And you alluded to it just really briefly, like, what are you up to today? You've done the walk. Yeah. What's next for you?
And our next step, our epiphany halfway through the campaign, and I already mentioned it, was that it wasn't our promise. Our promise was the igniter of millions of other promises. It was that promise I made on the bench to pay it forward started the push for change. But the push for change then started all these other, this domino effect. And so what we said is, look, our best place to be is in the schools. I can't carry the weight of this. Marie and I can't carry the weight of this. Solving youth homelessness or homelessness isn't going to be solved by one person. But if every single one of us made one promise to do something, activism, something creative, make a donation, support their local shelter, I don't care what it is, just get out and do something. So we launched the I Promise campaign. And so our call to action for participants that get inspired, or for the school kids that we meet, or the businesses, or the police officials that we meet, is to make a promise, register that promise, and make a difference in their community. So we've been working since January to build this software platform at thepushforchange.com, where you can go on and you can register, you can make your individual promise. It can be big or it can be small. And it can be something simple as, I'm going to look at seeing homeless people in a different way. Or I'm gonna take my company and we're gonna raise $500 at a barbecue, and we're gonna donate that to Covenant House, or to Directions in Vancouver. And so we're gonna launch that program. We've re-signed on with the Ontario Provincial Police. And so they're our partner in Ontario. And over the next year, starting in September, we're gonna visit 300 schools and impact over 100,000 young people. And we're gonna get them and ask them to make a promise. And so our goal forward now is that, now that this walk across Canada is done, we envision a country where we've inspired people to make 1 million promises. Check out our promise book, learn a little bit more about the Push for Change. There's some really great videos on there, and touch your community in a special way.
Well, thanks again, and thanks so much for what you're doing.
Hey, my pleasure.